For years, they looked unbreakable. Not just stable, not just happy, unbreakable. Every morning, millions watched them sit side by side, trading smiles and soft sarcasm across a studio sofa. They laughed at the same jokes. They teased each other with practiced ease. They finished each other's sentences in that way long-married couples sometimes do, the kind that makes strangers believe in permanence. Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford were more than presenters. They were a living advertisement for endurance. A marriage that had survived decades in an industry that destroys relationships as quickly as it creates them. So, when the divorce announcement came, it didn't just surprise people. It stunned them. There had been no explosive scandal, no public arguments, no obvious betrayal. Just a short, carefully worded statement confirming that after more than 20 years together, it was over. Ruth spoke first. Calm, controlled, measured. She described a relationship that had simply run its course. Two people who had grown apart. No villains, no accusations, just inevitability. And everyone believed her. Eamonn said nothing. And in silence, the world made its own conclusions. But silence is rarely empty. Sometimes it is calculation. Sometimes it is exhaustion. And sometimes it is survival. Months later, when Eamonn finally began to speak, the story shifted in ways few expected. Not because he offered dramatic confessions, not because he named specific wrongs, but because he described something far more unsettling. He described what it feels like to disappear inside your own marriage. And once you hear that, you start to question everything you thought you knew. At the beginning, their relationship felt genuine. Two broadcasters who met at work, fell in love at work, and built a life that unfolded in front of cameras. Viewers didn't just watch their show, they watched their marriage. But there is something dangerous about loving someone in public. When you are paid to be charming together 5 days a week, charm becomes part of the job. Banter becomes rehearsed. Affection becomes content. You learn which glances the camera loves, which disagreements feel playful instead of tense, which stories land best with the audience. And slowly, without anyone noticing, the line between who you are and who you perform begins to blur. They were professionals. They understood chemistry. They understood timing. They understood that viewers felt comfort in consistency. But comfort is not intimacy. When your relationship becomes part of your brand, you stop asking whether you are happy. You start asking whether you look happy. And if millions believe it, does it matter what is happening when the studio lights go off? For years, nothing looked wrong. That's what made it so effective. No public fights. No awkward moments on air. No rumors swirling through tabloids. Just steady familiarity. And familiarity can masquerade as love for a very long time. But inevitability is not the same as connection. And a marriage performed often enough can begin to replace the real one. They knew their lines. They knew their roles. And perhaps somewhere along the way, they stopped asking whether those roles still fit. The moment the divorce became public, Ruth moved carefully. She didn't attack. She didn't dramatize. She didn't reveal details. Instead, she offered something far more powerful: reasonableness. She framed the separation as natural, mature, mutual. There was no anger in her words, no bitterness, just calm acceptance. And calm is persuasive, because she had always been perceived as composed, steady, practical. Her narrative carried weight. It felt balanced, fair, and in the absence of conflict, people tend to fill in blanks with their own assumptions. Eamonn's silence became part of that narrative. Why wasn't he defending himself? Why wasn't he sharing his version? Surely, if there were more to the story, he would speak. And when he didn't, the quiet began to feel suspicious. Silence, in the public arena, often reads as guilt. What few people consider is how quickly a story can calcify. Once the first version is accepted, every new piece of information is measured against it, and changing public perception becomes almost impossible. By the time Eamonn considered speaking, the emotional verdict had already been delivered. People assume silence means weakness, but sometimes silence is restraint. In highly public separations, every sentence is dissected. Headlines twist nuance into accusation. Complex emotions become clickbait. Eamonn understood that anything he said could be weaponized. If he appeared defensive, he would seem guilty. If he expressed hurt, he would appear bitter. If he criticized, he would look vindictive. So he stayed quiet. But silence has a cost. With each passing week, speculation grew. Commentators analyzed his demeanor. Relationship experts on daytime television interpreted body language from old clips. Opinion columns discussed what his quiet revealed about masculinity and accountability. People who had never been inside his home felt confident explaining what had happened there. And slowly, he watched himself become a character in someone else's story. There is a particular loneliness in that experience, seeing a version of yourself accepted as truth that doesn't align with the person you know yourself to be. He wasn't just losing a marriage. He was losing control of his identity. Then there was the part of the story few fully understood. The illness. Chronic pain doesn't arrive dramatically. It doesn't announce itself with spectacle. It creeps in. A stiffness here. A dull ache there. Something you assume will pass. Until it doesn't. For Eamonn, what began as discomfort evolved into a daily negotiation with his own body. Sitting required calculation. Standing required preparation. Travel required medication. Work required endurance. Mobility shrank. Independence shrank with it. When your body stops cooperating, your world gets smaller. And when your world gets smaller, the person closest to you becomes everything. Ruth stepped in. She managed appointments, scheduled specialists, organized medications, drove him places, adjusted their routines around his limitations. From the outside, it looked like devotion. And perhaps at first it was, but dependence alters the architecture of a relationship. When one partner becomes the caretaker, the balance shifts. Decisions begin to flow in one direction. The stronger partner, physically, emotionally, organizationally, takes control. Not necessarily out of malice, but control nonetheless. And control, even when well-intentioned, changes how love feels. The transition was gradual. Small suggestions at first. Maybe you shouldn't attend that event. It'll be too much. Let me handle that. You need a rest. That call can wait. Reasonable, sensible, protective. And because the reasoning centered on his well-being, it became difficult to resist. Pushing back felt ungrateful. Arguing felt selfish. But over time, suggestions became decisions. Which invitations were accepted? Which friends were seen? How long visits lasted? What commitments were realistic? What was best for him? And something subtle began to happen. His preferences started to shrink. Not because he didn't have them, but because expressing them required energy he didn't always have. Care and control exist on a spectrum. And when you're tired, grateful, or vulnerable, it's hard to see when that line gets crossed. He began to feel managed rather than partnered, protected but not heard. And the most confusing part? It didn't look abusive. It looked responsible. That's what made it so hard to name. Homes are supposed to feel safe. A place where you stop performing, where you breathe differently, where you are not observed. But when illness narrows your world, the house becomes your entire universe. And within that universe, dynamics intensify. Eamonn began noticing how often his movements were monitored. Not overtly, not aggressively, just constant awareness. Questions about conversations, comments about phone calls, casual observations that felt too precise. If he mentioned discomfort, it was reframed as concern. If he asked for space, it was framed as unnecessary. If he expressed frustration, it was attributed to medication or stress. And slowly, he began editing himself. He avoided certain topics, avoided certain calls, avoided certain disagreements, not because he feared confrontation, but because he lacked the energy for prolonged tension. When your body is already fighting you, emotional conflict feels unbearable. So he adapted. Adaptation, in the short term, feels like peace. In the long term, it feels like erasure. There is often one moment in relationships, not necessarily explosive, that reframes everything. For him, it came unexpectedly. An overheard conversation. Not dramatic, not shouted, just casual. Ruth speaking on the phone, describing his condition, his limitations, their life. But the tone was different. Detached, clinical, slightly weary. Not cruel, but stripped of warmth. He listened, frozen, as his life was summarized as logistics, as his presence felt like a management issue, as their marriage sounded less like a partnership and more like an obligation. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. And in that shift of tone, something inside him settled into clarity. He realized he no longer recognized the relationship he thought they had. The care he felt grateful for carried undertones of resentment. The structure he leaned on carried imbalance. The partnership he believed in felt transactional. He didn't confront her, because sometimes confrontation only invites denial. And sometimes you already know what the response will be. Instead, he simply understood, and once understanding arrives, you can't unsee it. The public statement was brief, respectful, neutral, designed to close doors, not open them. It said nothing about power shifts, nothing about dependency, nothing about identity loss, nothing about resentment. It preserved dignity. It also preserved silence. Public relationships rarely end with full honesty. Too many reputations are involved, too many shared histories, too many legal considerations. So they chose discretion. But discretion leaves space for speculation. And speculation filled the gap. When Eamonn finally began to speak, he didn't deliver accusations. He spoke about something quieter. He spoke about losing himself, about how chronic pain made him vulnerable in ways he hadn't anticipated, about how vulnerability altered power dynamics, about how strength, even admirable strength, can overshadow someone who is struggling. He didn't claim victimhood. He described suffocation without using the word. He described shrinking. He described waking up one day and realizing he didn't recognize the version of himself that had emerged. And that is a different kind of confession, because it forces people to reconsider a simpler narrative. Maybe there wasn't a villain. Maybe there was imbalance. Maybe there was love that morphed into management. Maybe there was strength that unintentionally devoured the space another person needed. And maybe silence wasn't guilt. Maybe it was survival. Ruth's strength was never in question. She was organized, capable, efficient, composed. Those qualities likely held their world together for years. But strength, without reflection, can dominate. When one partner becomes the engine of the relationship, the other can slowly become cargo, not by force, by momentum. He became smaller as she became stronger. And perhaps neither of them noticed in real time, because imbalance rarely announces itself loudly. It settles in quietly. It becomes routine. It feels practical. Until one day, it feels unbearable. Their marriage didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, under public performance, under chronic pain, under unspoken resentment, under shifting power. By the time the announcement came, the ending had already happened privately. Two people who once fit together perfectly found themselves living parallel lives under the same roof. And when the door finally closed, the world saw only the summary, not the years that led to it. Divorce is rarely about one moment. It is about accumulation, of silence, of adaptation, of imbalance, of things left unsaid. When Eamonn broke his silence, he didn't destroy a narrative. He complicated it. And sometimes complication is closer to truth than certainty ever was. Because behind every public separation lies a private reality that outsiders will never fully understand. Not performance, not headlines, not carefully worded statements. Just two human beings who tried, and eventually failed, to keep something alive that had already changed beyond recognition. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. If this story made you question what you thought you knew, stay with us. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that unfold quietly long before anyone notices they're happening.